So we're moving into 1 Kings, and we're in chapter 1. 1 Kings, once again, this is going to be the beginning of Solomon's reign. It's beginning of the story of the kings of Israel and Judah, as Israel is divided into two nations, 10 tribes that make up the part that's called Israel, 10 northern tribes, and then 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, that make up what we call Judah in the southern part. The nation's divided. So what we begin with here is going to be the reign of Solomon, which is really the only time when there was probably the best time, let's say that, of one king reigning over the entire nation, all 12 tribes, in peace and prosperity. This is probably the best time in Israel's history, is when Solomon takes the throne, because the enemies are pretty much defeated. It's a time of peace, it's a time of prosperity, and it's a time when the nation is united. And this is the last time. When we come to Solomon's son, then right in that very next generation, we see the nation divided into 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. Well, David in his old age, it says here, chapter 1, he actually has to have somebody come take care of him, and a story of Abishag. That's quite a story. A young woman that comes and just to stay with him, actually lay in the bed with him to keep him warm. We call her, the human hot water bottle. And just in case you're curious, the Bible actually tells us he did not have relations with her, okay? If you're nosy enough and you want to know that kind of stuff. He doesn't have relations with her. She just comes to take care of him. He's an old man. He doesn't not create much heat of his own. She's taking care of him, and she actually stays there to keep him warm. Well, one of the sons decides he's going to take advantage of the situation. It says in verse 5, "Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, 'I will be king.' So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him. And his father had never crossed him at any time by asking, 'Why have you done so?' And he was also a very handsome man, and he was born after Absalom." So it's giving you a little history, a quick history of Adonijah. He's one of David's sons. He was born after Absalom. He's a handsome guy. Absalom is dead now. Adonijah seems like he might be a good guy to take over the throne. So in verse 9 it says, "Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen, fatlings by the stone of Zoheleth, which is beside En-Rogel. And he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and the men of Judah, the king's servants. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the mighty men, Benaiah, who's the leader of David's army at this point, really, the mighty men, and Solomon his brother." So he neglected to bring Nathan the prophet, Benaiah, the mighty men that followed with Benaiah, and Solomon to this celebration of him being king. Well, Nathan the prophet comes along in verse 11 and says, that Adonijah has done this. He's declared himself. He comes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and says, "Did you know Adonijah's the king?" And she's like, "Well, I had no idea. David has said that Solomon would be king." And so Nathan and Bathsheba get together, get a plan up, and they said, "Bathsheba, you go in with Solomon and you tell him, did you know Adonijah's king?" And then Nathan says, "I'll follow up right after you're in there and come in and say, 'King, did you know Adonijah's king?'" And so that happens. Bathsheba goes in with Solomon. David says, "What do you want?" In verse 17, "And she said to him, 'My lord, you swore to your maidservant by the Lord your God, saying, Surely your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. And now,' verse 18, 'behold, Adonijah is king, and now my lord the king, you do not know it.'" And so Adonijah had sacrifices, and he had Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army, and all of these folks there, and they had this big celebration, and he declared himself king. In verse 22 it says, "And behold, while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet came in. And they told the king, saying, 'Nathan's here.' And when he came in before the king, he prostrated himself before the king, his face to the ground." Verse 24, "Nathan said, 'My lord the king, have you said Adonijah shall be king after me? And for he's gone down today, and he's declared himself king.' And so David, verse 28, King David answered and said, 'Call Bathsheba to me.' And she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king vowed and said, 'As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, surely as I vowed to you by the Lord God, saying, Your son Solomon shall be king after me. He shall sit on my throne in my place. I will indeed do so this day.'" So here's David's really his one last act as king is declaring who's going to be king after him. Well, verse 34, Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there as king over Israel and blow the trumpet and say, long live King Solomon. So there's this declaration that's going out even after Adonijah's done the same thing, basically. He's been anointed as king, but now Zadok the priest, under the authority of David the king, and Nathan the prophet, under the authority of David the king, they anoint Solomon as king. So we go down to verse 38. So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the Cherethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and brought him to Gihon. Zadok the priest then took the horn of oil in the tent from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and the people said, long live King Solomon. And then verse 40 is interesting here. It says, and all the people went up after him, and the people were playing on flutes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth shook at their noise. So here, Adonijah declared himself as king. He's an illegal king in office. He's already reigning as king. He's put himself in there himself. But David comes along through Nathan the prophet and the priesthood through Zadok, and he says, no, Solomon's going to be king. And when it happens and they do this, there's such a rejoicing in the land that the earth shakes. I think it's really significant, that we see this, and may it happen in America someday. Anyway, that we rejoice so much at the overthrow of an illegal ruler that the earth shakes. Well, while this happens, of course, Adonijah is a little bit scared. All of a sudden, the king is behind a whole nother appointment. He's appointed Solomon as king, and Adonijah in verse 49 says, then all the guests of Adonijah were terrified, and they arose and each went on his way. So here we got Adonijah had all of his group around him. They were celebrating. They were, eating the sheep and, all this kind of stuff, having a big feast and party. And all of a sudden, everyone hears, long live King Solomon, and they split. They're on the run. They're getting out of there, and they leave Adonijah alone. It says, and Adonijah, verse 50, was afraid of Solomon, and he rose, went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Now that's kind of a thing where, you go in and it's kind of a place of submitted surrender. The horns of the altar. It's, you go in and it's kind of like you're praying, and you're like, I have no hope here. Have mercy on me. And so he's at the horns of the altar. And interestingly enough, Solomon does have mercy. It said, verse 51, I was told Solomon, saying, behold, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, for behold, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. And Solomon said, if he will be a worthy man, not one of his hairs will fall to the ground, but if wickedness is found in him, he will die. Verse 53, so King Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar. He came and prostrated himself before King Solomon. Solomon said to him, go to your house. So Solomon lets him go, has mercy on him, even after this time when Adonijah tried to illegally overthrow the government. We see that a lot going on here in this time, don't we? There's overthrows of government and a lot of turmoil, really turmoil. But in the midst of it, what's happening is God is still executing his plan. There's still a righteous plan. There's still an oversight that God has. He's still controlling things, even through the misbehaviors and behaviors of his people and people that are even against him. He's still executing a plan in which now the seed of David is going to now build a temple that David wanted to build. But also the greater seed is going to come through the line of Solomon, the greater seed being, the Messiah that would come, the promised Messiah would come through that line. And so we see all of that being set in motion here in David's last days. And so in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, just the first two verses we'll look. It says, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. I kind of like that statement, that, it's just, this just happens. You know what? People die. I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. David's last charge to Solomon is, I'm going to die, I'm not going to be here, but you can do this. Just rise up. And it's especially good if we understand that God is behind it. We don't have to do it in our own strength, that this is part of God's plan. And so as we look through the scriptures, we can see that kind of thing, that it's that faith and trust in God all through it, and that in his plan, his purpose, and that it's not totally up to us, but we do take our action. Be strong, be a man. Take your time, stand up, do what you're supposed to do.